This morning on the program, the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary to the Opposition Leader and for Trade and Investment, Jim Chalmers. Good morning, Jim.
G'day, Kieran. And
here in the Canberra studio, the Liberal Senator, Zed Seselja. Zed, it's good to see you as well. Now, this tax clean-up, clearing the decks as we saw from Joe Hockey yesterday, Chris Bowen, when I spoke to him this morning, says that there's a fair bit of hypocrisy here. First of all, on the deficit issue, that the coalition made it a big issue in opposition, but now, in the last couple of months, has simply been building that deficit.
No, not at all, Kieran. It is a big issue, and the coalition is going about the task of fixing it. But you don't fix it by having never-ending taxes on Australians. You don't fix the deficit by continuing to attack people's superannuation savings, for instance, as Labor had planned to do. You fix it by growing the economy and making sensible savings, and that's what the coalition is doing. So we believe in lower taxes. We believe in getting rid of the carbon tax. We don't believe in raiding people's superannuation. We believe in getting rid of this FBT hike and all sorts of other things. That will help grow the economy. That will see industry flourish.
So no contradiction here, despite making the deficit such a big issue, and now through the Reserve Bank Reserve Fund and also not, well, some of these measures that you're not going to be following through with these tax proposals.
We were very clear on that.
Makes the bottom line more difficult.
But we were very clear before the election, Kieran, as to what we were going to do in this area. We said we would get rid of the carbon tax. We said we would not follow Labor's path and attack people's superannuation savings. I mean, people need to have some confidence that when they save for their retirement, that they won't see ever-increasing taxes from the government on their superannuation savings. We should be encouraging people to save for their retirements. That's what the coalition's committed to, and the process that we've put in place will help that.
Jim Chalmers, Zed Seselja's right, isn't he, when he says that they campaigned on it, they were up front on it, and there's nothing here that is going to surprise anyone. This is they've got a mandate for it.
I just think, I can't believe that Zed just said that he's against attacking superannuation savings. 3.6 million low-income earners in our country are being attacked by the Abbott and Hockey government with Zed's support. They're getting the low-income super contribution taken away, 3.6 million of them, 60% of them are women, all of them are low-income earners. To come on this program and pretend that you're not attacking millions of people's superannuation savings is an absurdity. It shouldn't be allowed to let stand. You described, Kieran.
This was based on the mining tax. The mining tax isn't raising any revenue, Jim. So you put in place a tax that you claimed was going to bring in billions of dollars. It's a failed tax.
Let's hear Jim.
Money, so it won't pay for that measure.
Jim, you just clarify and finalise your point. I'll come back to Zed on that.
Yeah, what we saw yesterday was a stunning illustration of the priorities of the government. Giving money to 16,000 people, the wealthiest people in the superannuation system, taking money away from 3.6 million of the poorest people in our superannuation system. You described that, Kieran, in your introduction as a clean-up of the tax system. It's unfortunately for Middle Australia, it's people on low and middle incomes that are getting cleaned up.
Now, Zed Seselja, to that point on equity, OK, you're making that point about the mining tax. That's fine. That's a separate point. What about the point on equity? When the tax on earnings of upwards of $100K a year, that's people with nest eggs of more than $2 million, that tax has been removed, and yet you're also removing a $500 a year co-payment for the least well off. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, there's two separate issues here, Kieran. One is about what kind of taxes we have on our superannuation regime. We believe that we should keep our taxes as low as possible. That's for everyone. That's if you are a relatively low income earner or a middle income earner. We want to see taxes as low as we can possibly make them. The issue around a specific rebate or a specific subsidy for superannuation is different. That was tied directly to the mining tax. The money isn't there because the mining tax has been such a failure. And when we said we would abolish the mining tax, we said we would abolish associated measures. This was never going to be paid for. So it was one big lie by the Labor Party.
Let's go to Jim Chalmers.
I want those people who would have been expecting that.
I want to pick up one of the points that you make there, and it's about certainty for people's nest egg. Regardless of how much it's worth, Jim, the people concerned have earned what they've got in their retirement savings. They too should have certainty from government interference or taxation. So the government's not giving them any greater any payments. They're essentially just giving them what they've earned themselves.
It's about the priorities, Kieran. So what the measure that the Labor government announced would do was to tax the very high earnings beyond a certain amount in the superannuation system would only affect 16,000 people. What the Liberal Party and Zed and Hockey want to do is make the superannuation savings of almost 4 million low-income Australians less secure. That's basically what the argument is here. I believe that we should be focusing our relief in the superannuation system towards the low and middle, and Zed thinks that the relief should be focused at the top. It's as simple as that.
But what about the argument, you're a former Chief of Staff to the Treasurer, the former Treasurer Wayne Swan. What about the argument about compliance costs? Because Joe Hockey says that the compliance costs would have outweighed the amount that would have been collected from that tax on revenue of the nest eggs of $2 million plus.
I think compliance costs is one of those convenient things that people who work in the superannuation industry or who would be affected by some of these things, you always get the argument about compliance costs or process or whatever. I'm unconvinced of that argument. I think it really comes down to a principled argument about when you've got a limited amount of money in the superannuation system in terms of government assistance or tax breaks or whatever, and I think that should be going, the relief should be going to low and middle. Zed thinks they should be going to the top.
Final point, Zed.
Yeah, look, what this would have been also, Kieran, is a real creeping tax because not only did Labor say they wouldn't do it before the last election and then tried to bring it in for $100,000, but in coming years, more and more Australians would be paying that tax. So you would see a much higher proportion. It would be a bracket creep would get so many more. So what we want to do is keep it as simple as possible, keep taxes as low as possible, so that when people put away their own money for their retirements, they can have some certainty.
I want to play a little bit more of my interview this morning with Chris Bowen. This relates to the general issue of this cleaning the decks, as Joe Hockey described it yesterday, of nearly 100 taxes that had been announced but not legislated or moved on. Here was Chris Bowen on the general announcements. He's accused Mr Hockey of hypocrisy.
Campaigning to reduce the deficit, and then every measure they've taken since then has increased the deficit, whether it be the Reserve Bank grant or the changes they announced yesterday, and wrong values and priorities, making it a priority to give back a tax concession to 16,000 Australians with more than $2 million in their superannuation accounts.
Now, Zed Seselja, on the issue of the cap for self-education expenses, Mr Bowen also warned this morning that can be potentially rorted, and taxpayers then stumping up for people on overseas trips, education, tagged as education trips, but essentially being rorted. What do you say to that?
Well, if it's being rorted, that should be investigated, but that's not what this is about. This was class warfare and it backfired. I went to forums during the election with the Nurses Federation, and the nurses were raising concerns about this. Wayne Swan, and no doubt Jim Chalmers helping out, thought that this would be a great thing to attack doctors, and they made much of, jet-setting doctors. That's not what this was about. This hurt nurses, teachers, doctors and other professionals who should be encouraged and in fact are required to go out there and self-educate and continuing professional education. They attacked people in a class warfare-like way. It's backfired because people like nurses and teachers have been affected by this. So this is a very sensible change, and I think that there'd be very few people who would be defending this measure, including people who are nurses, people who are teachers and people who work in other
Jim,
fields.
apparently 80%, according to the Treasurer, 80% of those that made claims in this regard were earned less than $80,000 a year, trying to educate and improve their income capacity. This sounds like an equitable move. You're accusing the government of being inequitable. This, to me, looks like a great deal of fairness and sounds like a good move too to remove that cap.
Well, we're all for self-education. We didn't remove the entitlement entirely. We put a cap on it. Partly to make it a more responsible measure, but also because there is some evidence that beyond a certain amount, quite often this entitlement gets used for personal purposes, and we wanted to make sure that the money was going where it's needed most, which is the courses, the equipment that people need to educate themselves and give themselves new opportunities, new promotions and all of that sort of thing.
Okay, let's take a break. We'll be right back. We've got a few other issues to look at, including just how much Clive Palmer spent on his election campaign. A quick break on AIM Agenda, and we'll be back shortly.
At NAB, we lend more to Australian business than any other bank. Our competition, however, just dropped the ball. More give, less take.
Australia, you need a break. And with these great low fares from Jetstar, now's the perfect time to take one. Take off from Sydney to Melbourne Tullamarine from $69. Melbourne Tullamarine to Hamilton Island from $169. Adelaide to Cairns from $179. Or Perth to Lombok from just $179. Fares are one way, checked baggage not included, but may be added for an additional fee. Not available on all flights or days, conditions apply.
To book, visit jetstar.com.
At the precise moment a tomato hung heavy on its vine, quinoa was picked by the boxful, wheat was harvested, lettuce was plucked from the ground, cheese ripened perfectly, and delicious combinations of seeds and grains were skillfully kneaded together. And now, all these ingredients are about to become even more delicious together. It's not just bread, it's Helga's.
What's that?
Energize, double the protein.
Energize, pumped with double the protein of regular Up and Go.
Syria's children share the same dreams and hopes as Australia's children, but their lives are being destroyed by a war that has killed nearly 7,000 children and forced 3 million more to flee their homes. The survivors are desperate for food, water and shelter. Save the Children is on the ground saving and protecting lives, but more children urgently need your help. Please donate today and give them hope. A gift of just $20 could provide life-saving support. Visit savethechildren.org.au. Thank you.
This is AIM Agenda. Thanks for your company. With me this morning in Brisbane, the Labor frontbencher Jim Chalmers. Here in the Canberra studio, Liberal Senator Zed Seselja. Jim, I want to ask you about the front page of the Courier Mail this morning. Billionaire hot seat. The Parliamentary Committee on Electoral Matters is going to look at just how much was spent, apparently, on the Palmer campaign. It would have been a lot, but as has been pointed out in the newspaper this morning, it's allowed. There's nothing stopping him from spending that much on his campaign.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, including myself, are pretty worried about the growing influence of money on politics in Australia. We don't want to go down that American path that has people, the wealthiest in our community, the most likely to win seats in the parliament. We can't have a government, of the wealthy, by the wealthy, for the wealthiest in our community. So Clive Palmer is a bit of a worrying trend in that sense, but as the article points out, and as others will point out, there is nothing, illegal about the obscene amount of money that he spent on his own campaign winning those seats.
Are you suggesting, Jim, that the system's heading down the American track? Is that what you're worried about?
I am worried about that. That's my personal view. I've been worried about it for some time. You do have heavier influence from people who can, buy the most advertising and all of that, and to some extent that's inevitable. But the Palmer experience of the last election should strike fear into the hearts of people who want a broad and diverse political debate, one where it's the strength of your ideas and not the size of your bank account that matters.
And so, as I mentioned, the front page, Zed Seselja of the Courier Mail, the billionaire hot seat is its headline, and asking just how much was spent. Obviously a lot, and it proved very effective. He's won at least 2 seats in the Senate, as well as his lower house seat of Fairfax.
Well, look, who knows? I think if we're going to be critical of Clive Palmer, let's be critical of his policies. I think, we don't know how much he spent. No doubt it was a significant amount, and many parties spent a significant amount as well. If we're concerned about the influence of money, I mean, there's all sorts of things we should look at. I mean, here in the ACT, poker machines fund the Labor Party for the most part. So, there's all sorts of issues you could look at. I don't think we should just focus on one individual. Some individuals will spend a lot of money on their campaigns. I don't think that's the major issue. Here in the ACT, we did do some campaign finance reform, which we pushed through. I think that was some sensible measures, put some caps on expenditure, those sorts of things, but I don't...
So you agree with Jim in that sense, that you think that there should be a cap on overall spending?
Well, certainly we saw in the ACT that it was appropriate. Whether that would be reasonable at a national level, I think that's something I'd give further consideration to, and no doubt the Committee on Electoral Matters will look at those type of things, but I don't think we should focus on one individual. Individuals are free to spend money on their campaigns. It's not the first time it's happened, and just as poker machine interests can fund the Labor Party here in the ACT, individuals can fund their own campaigns.
Zed Seselja, the front page, while we're looking at the newspaper coverage this morning, the Advertiser, Holden escape plan is its headline, and looks at this contingency plan that the chairperson of the Advanced Manufacturing Council in that state has done, basically to cushion industry, other industries, small business and so on down the supply chain that would be affected if Holden closed its doors. This is a cabinet in confidence document they're reporting on, but they're looking at the contingency that Holden might shut as early as 2016.
Yeah, well, obviously we don't want to see that, but I think looking at where the car...
They're not optimistic about government support then from the coalition?
Well, look, I think there's a range of factors that are creating some pessimism in the industry, and of course we've seen some of the tax changes that the Labor Party attempted, and we saw figures out just today with the FBT and what that did to the industry. So there's a whole mix of measures. I think when it comes to this issue, we do want to see a car industry in Australia, but I think from my own perspective, I think it's important that we don't negotiate with a gun to our head, and that we don't simply write a blank cheque. Organisations like Holden need to be better in the way that they deliver. It's not just about government and government support. They need to be self-sustaining, and that's one of the challenges I think the industry faces.
Jim Chalmers, is there an inevitability, regardless of who's in power, that the automotive industry has well, we can see its use-by date, essentially, that we've seen Ford already announce it's going to end manufacturing. That was on Labor's watch, and now preparations, it seems, in South Australia for the prospect that Holden could close as early as 2016.
Oh, it's a difficult future for the car industry, there's no doubt about that, and a lot of people are concerned about the hundreds of thousands of jobs that are attached to that industry, me included. I think you'd have to describe the former Labor government as a good friend of the car industry, and more particularly of all of those workers in the industry. I just want to pick up on what Zed said about the tax changes. I mean, it's ridiculous to pretend that there was no problems in the car industry. Then there was our tax announcement, which ruined everything. The car industry has had a long and difficult path, and the future will be difficult for it as well. The Labor government did a lot of things of which I'm proud to help nurture that industry and to help look after the workers in that industry. What's happening now is really there is a lot of uncertainty, heightened uncertainty really, because there's a split in the Liberal Party about whether or not they want to assist those workers in the industry. So behind closed doors, we know that half the party wants to do nothing and half the party wants to do something. And for as long as that the Liberal Party is so hopelessly split on the issue, there will be heightened uncertainty and heightened anxiety in the car industry, not just in South Australia but around the country, where people make components and all the sorts of things that feed into the industry itself.
Do you accept there are differing views within the party on these matters?
There's always a range of views on these matters, but can I go back to the policy settings that Jim was touching on? I mean, I saw Kim Carr commenting today, and he was saying, oh, it's nothing to do with the FBT. Of course, it's nothing to do with the other taxes like the carbon tax. It's all to do with whether or not you're giving enough assistance. Labor is getting it completely wrong. That is going back to before the Hawke and Keating era in thinking. He's saying it doesn't matter how much we tax them, in the end we'll just give a bigger handout. That's completely the wrong way to approach it. Surely we should be looking at getting settings in place which make industry thrive so that we don't constantly rely on larger and larger handouts in order to stop them from leaving. So that's actually the key here. Kim Carr, the Labor spokesman on this issue, has said, no, it's got nothing to do with taxes, it's got nothing to do with settings, we just need to give them more money. Well, that's not a sustainable proposition.
The point, Jim, I suppose that many have made as well, is what about small business, what about other industries that struggle without any sort of taxpayer support and struggle on in the face of the high Aussie dollar or whatever else, like, you know, for example, the tourism industry?
Is that a question for me, Kieran?
It is, Jim, yes. So
sorry.
The equity in terms of the government treatment to other industries as well.
Yeah, well, you raised a couple of really good points. The high dollar is having a massive impact on the car industry. Didn't get a mention in Zed's spiel just then about all the ills that the car industry confronts. The high dollar is a massive part of that. When it comes to small business, there's another important illustration of priorities in what Joe Hockey announced yesterday, actually, and I'm glad you raised small business. In eliminating one of the measures that we had for the biggest business in our community, Joe Hockey is clinging to their cut to the investment allowance for the smallest businesses in our community. So Zed and Joe Hockey and others wander around and say, oh, we've got to get the settings right. But at the same time as they're saying that, they are directly impacting in a negative way the investment climate for small business in our country. So you've got to get behind the rhetoric where Zed says we've got to get the settings right and it's all Labor's fault. Beyond that, what are they actually doing and what are they actually cutting and what impact does that have on the industry right around the country? That's the most important thing.
Zed, your final thoughts? We're almost out of time.
Yeah, look, we've got a comprehensive plan that we're going to start rolling out that is about cutting red tape for business. And we've started with getting rid of the carbon tax. We're going to be abolishing some of the duplication, some of the green and red tape. The Coalition has always been a friend to small business. Okay. But we do have to make budgetary decisions. We have to make budgetary decisions as well in order to fix the mess that Labor left us.
Gentlemen, we're out of time. Jim and Zed, thanks so much for that this morning. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.